Right, it's 3 minutes past 3 in the UK here, so we'll get started and people may join as we go on, but otherwise this is being recorded and will be hopefully made available to everybody in the near future if anybody else wants to have a watch. So good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you may be joining us from. Welcome to our non-side event on securing non-proliferation and disarmament through the nuclear responsibilities approach. Before I go over a couple of usual housekeeping rules for today's session and introduce our speakers, I would just like to thank you all for joining us. Of course, we are disappointed that the NPT review conference isn't going ahead right now as it should have been, but for obvious and very understandable reasons it's not. But we thought that it would be a real shame to cancel all of our events and miss an opportunity to connect with you all again for the first time in 2022. So welcome, and we're very glad you could join us today. I'll start by introducing myself for those of you who don't know me. My name is Alison Spilman. I'm a policy fellow at BASIC and also a PhD student at the University of Birmingham, and I'm acting as your chair today. I am joined today by my wonderful colleague, Sebastian Brixey-Williams, co-director of BASIC, and Professor Nicholas Wheeler from the University of Birmingham. And the two of them will be presenting on the Nuclear Responsibilities Toolkit to you in a moment. And I then have the privilege of inviting Professor Nina Tannenwald from Brown University, who doesn't really need an introduction to anybody in this field. And she'll be offering us some thoughts as our esteemed discussant. And then I'll open the floor up to all of you for any questions or comments you may have on what's presented to you. And the whole session is due to last about an hour. So housekeeping. Things you can ask questions in two ways pretty much. So whilst the speakers are speaking, I would definitely encourage you to write any questions or comments you have in the chat box, and then I'll pick them up later. Alternatively, once the speakers are done, you can raise your hand using the raise hand function that's in the reactions button, and I'll call on you and you can ask your question in front of the whole group. So please do be thinking of questions along the way so that I'm not faced with that, impeding sense of doom at the end of the speakers' talks where I have to think of my own questions. That would be particularly embarrassing for me, especially because we are recording this session. But yes, usual Zoom etiquette applies as well. Please keep yourselves muted unless you are invited to speak by myself or one of the speakers, just to avoid any background noise interfering. And if possible, I would love for you to have your cameras on. It'd be lovely to see some familiar faces and some new faces, if at all possible, but of course, no pressure there. So the recording is already on, I think. Yep. And with that, I'll hand straight over to Professor Nicholas Wheeler.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Alice. I'd like to echo my words of welcome. It's a pleasure for Sebastian, Alice and I to have this opportunity to talk to you about the Nuclear Responsibilities Programme and indeed launch our Nuclear Responsibilities Toolkit. I'm especially delighted that Nina Tannenwald can join us as discussant. Nina's 2007 book, The Nuclear Taboo, is a landmark publication for anyone thinking about these questions. I'm going to briefly explain the Nuclear Responsibilities approach, what we hope to achieve with it, before Sebastian takes over and explores the possibilities for developing a shared conception of nuclear responsibilities. So, given that our event today is focused around how the nuclear responsibilities approach can contribute to strengthening the NPT, I'd like to begin by reading out a few lines from the penultimate paragraph of the preamble to the treaty. Desiring to further the easing of international tension and the strengthening of trust between states, in order to facilitate the cessation of the manufacture of nuclear weapons, the liquidation of all their existing stockpiles, and the elimination from national arsenals of nuclear weapons and the means of their delivery, pursuant to a treaty on general and complete disarmament under strict and effective international control, end quote. Now, the drafters of the treaty articulated here the underlying belief that a disarmed nuclear world would only become possible through the, quote, strengthening of trust between states. It is this belief and commitment that guides our programme, and indeed the wider mission of BASIC. Now, two key points flow from this language in the preamble. The first is that nuclear disarmament is not intrinsically security enhancing. A disarmed world would be a far more dangerous place than our current nuclear world if there is a lack of trust. And secondly, there will be no path to nuclear disarmament that does not go through a process of strengthening trust. So how then does the nuclear responsibilities approach contribute to the building of trust? The nuclear responsibilities approach is defined as, quote, a way of reframing how we think, talk, and write about nuclear weapons, one that puts an actor's responsibilities in relation to nuclear weapons at its centre. Now, we got started thinking about the relationship between nuclear weapons and responsibility back in 2016 via an ESRC, AHRC funded project on nuclear ethics and global security. 2016 was a time of enormous acrimony in global nuclear politics, you'll recall, which has arguably only got worse recently. Blame was flying in all directions. The failure of the 2015 NPT review conference was still felt. You had, as today, the nuclear weapon states blaming one another for the lack of progress on disarmament. You had the non-nuclear weapon states blaming the irresponsible nuclear weapon states for the same reason. And the nuclear weapon states were firing back to say that the non-nuclear weapon states were the ones who were behaving irresponsibly. The blame game in global nuclear politics is characterized by an emphasis on rights on the part of both possessor and non-possessor nuclear states. By this, I mean claims like, my state has a right to possess nuclear weapons, versus my state has a right to live in a world free of nuclear weapons. Now, conflicts based on rights-based statements like these are extremely hard to overcome. But what we sometimes forget, and the focus of our programme, is that with rights come responsibilities. Now, we recognise that the normative language of responsibilities has been woven into the fabric of the NPT from the outset, and that the nuclear weapon states have recognised and been accorded so-called special responsibilities for the reduction of nuclear risks and the advancement of disarmament. Indeed, an affirmation of these special responsibilities can be seen in the pre-January statement by the P5, where they reaffirm the Reagan-Gorbachev statement from November 1985 and pledge, quote, the avoidance of war between nuclear weapon states and the reduction of strategic risks as our foremost responsibilities. Nevertheless, distrust remains the hardy perennial in relations between the most powerful members of the P5. And there is a yawning chasm between the nuclear possessors who think nuclear possession is responsible and those, especially states parties to the TPNW, who think responsible possession is a dangerous contradiction in terms. Now, our purpose on this programme is not to address who is failing to live up to their responsibilities in global nuclear politics. Instead, it is to draw attention to the chronic culture of blame that fuels distrust and contracts the potential for empathy between those who hold different perceptions of their nuclear responsibilities. Our contribution to attempting to bridge these conflicting responsibility claims is a new dialogical approach. This explores, through the responsibilities framework set out in the Nuclear Responsibilities Toolkit, how each party thinks about their own nuclear responsibilities, who they owe these to, what policies and behaviour fulfil these responsibilities, how each understands their responsibilities to others, and crucially, how each perceives others' responsibilities towards them. Practicing such an approach commits us to suspending blame and approaching nuclear risk reduction through a special and rare form of empathy that Ken Booth and I called security dilemma sensibility. Security dilemma sensibility seeks to decommission mindsets of distrust by increasing awareness on the part of actors as to how others might be acting out of fear and insecurity rather than predatory intent, and crucially, an appreciation of how their own state's actions have contributed to these fears and insecurities. Empathy of this kind is rare among leaders and diplomats because they all too easily fall into the trap of thinking that others see them as they see themselves, namely actors with peaceful intent, failing to understand, of course, that others are not so easily reassured in the face of what they perceive as threatening capabilities. Security dilemma sensibility is a key precondition for that strengthening of trust that is so necessary if nuclear disarmament is to be both achievable and security enhancing. Sebastian will now talk about how the programme explores the possibilities for cultivating security dilemma sensibility through developing shared conceptions of nuclear responsibilities. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Alice, and hello, everybody. Nick's given us an overview of the theoretical thinking behind our development of the nuclear responsibilities approach, as well as with the help of a number of our colleagues at BASIC. So I'm going to talk primarily about the toolkit, the Nuclear Responsibilities Toolkit, which is the document that we're delighted to be launching today in its updated second edition, and why we think that it can make a useful contribution to the non-proliferation and disarmament regime underpinned by the NPT. So the Nuclear Responsibilities approach is a way of reframing how we think, talk, and write about nuclear weapons, one that puts actors' responsibilities in relation to nuclear weapons at its centre. The toolkit provides a conceptual and practical guide to do that, to help you put the approach into action. Our purpose in publishing the toolkit is to make it as easy as possible for individuals or groups, whether inside or outside government, to think through and discuss the nuclear responsibilities of different actors, including their own government perhaps, with a view to developing greater clarity about their responsibilities and strengthening the risk-reducing norms that surround nuclear weapons possession. The toolkit contains 4 sections, which I'll talk through briefly now. Part A gives an overview of the key concepts and terms that we use in relation to the nuclear responsibilities approach, as well as answering some frequently asked questions. Due to the constraints of time, I won't go into this section, but I hope it's self-explanatory and also useful. Part B, entitled Thinking About Nuclear Responsibilities, provides a framework, which Nick has mentioned, that you can use in a self-led way to think through an actor's responsibilities in relation to a specific issue. For the purposes of this event and our primary work within the programme, the issue we deal with is nuclear weapons, or some aspect of nuclear weapons. The idea here is that the responsibilities framework takes you through various questions in a linear, step-by-step fashion that help you explore your chosen actor's responsibilities in a thorough and systematic way. So it asks you questions like, who or what does your actor have responsibilities to? What are those responsibilities? Where do they come from? How do they translate from normative ideas into practical policies and practices? Are there tensions between the fulfillment of different responsibilities? If so, what are they? What else could you be doing to fulfill them or to communicate about them? And do others see your responsibilities in the same way that you see them? We had state governments in mind as the primary user of the framework, but of course it can be used by any actor who has responsibilities. And we've filled this table out internally for BASIC, which has been a really useful exercise in terms of thinking about our own internal mission and strategy. And we're going to repeat that exercise every year. So if you'd like to have a go with the framework, I would encourage you, and it's available for direct download from the BASIC website. And there's also a link on the toolkit on page 25. Part C, entitled Talking About Nuclear Responsibilities, sets out the 3-stage dialogue process that we've developed within the programme as a means to facilitate dialogue on nuclear responsibilities. In other words, this is a way of putting the framework into action and facilitating exchange between different parties about their responsibilities, including their responsibilities to one another. The detail of the dialogue process is best read in the toolkit and its annexes, but in general terms, it means engaging with individuals in small groups to get them thinking about their responsibilities and then bringing those groups together. The way we've done that in practice is to run what we call collective introspection meetings at the national level in a number of countries to consider the responsibilities of that government, of that country. And these have been either track 1.5 or track 2. And then eventually you bring those various national groups together for a multi-stakeholder dialogue. And we'll be running the next one of those in the next couple of months. Those meetings can help share different perspectives, identify areas of convergence and divergence, but also build interpersonal trust, sometimes across quite difficult political divides, through a dialogue that's a bit different from the kind of normal disputes that those people are used to. So if you're joining us from a government, and it doesn't matter whether that's a nuclear weapon state or a non-nuclear weapon state government, and you're interested in being involved with or even running a dialogue on responsibilities in relation to nuclear weapons, do have a read and get in touch with us. The model is ready to use and we're practiced at doing it, and we're really happy to assist you as we have with a number of governments already. Part D, entitled Writing About Nuclear Responsibilities, gives an overview of some of the different ways that people have written about these normative ideas recently, including our discussant, Nina Tannenwald. More and more publications are coming out that look at nuclear weapons through a responsibility lens, and we hope that these examples might inspire you to think about these ideas yourself in your own writing. So I said at the beginning I would say a few words about how the nuclear responsibilities approach can contribute to the non-proliferation and disarmament regime. As my starting point, I'd say that the NPT regime and the global nuclear order more generally is under serious challenge. Arms control has almost completely collapsed, and many have lost faith in the ability of the NPT alone to deliver disarmament. And there is a sense that hard-won nuclear norms and unspoken agreements about acceptable conduct are being eroded. Add to this that we have entered what some people call the third nuclear age, where there are more nuclear armed states, many new and emerging technologies, and a blurring of the conventional nuclear threshold. And many are worried about how all of this can be regulated, brought back into control. With the nuclear armed states not even sharing a common regime and a lack of political will to create one, it is hard to see how we can establish any formal binding rules to govern these weapons technologies. In its absence, our next speaker, Nina, has written that what is needed is a global regime of restraint and responsibility. And if you haven't read her 2020 article on this subject, I do encourage you to go and find it. What Nina and the Programme on Nuclear Responsibilities have in common is a shared belief that states need to agree to some basic principles about what is and is not acceptable behaviour in relation to nuclear weapons while they're still held in possession. Of course, such an agreement can only be reached through dialogue. And so how I'd like to frame the work of the Programme on Nuclear Responsibilities today is as the preparatory work, the travaux préparatoires, that could help to strengthen these core norms and deliver greater predictability and stability in the NPT regime. If the nuclear armed states in particular can agree to certain fundamental principles in relation to their nuclear arsenals, then that opens the door to more detailed agreements that seek to fulfill those principles further down the line. I think we've actually started to see something of that already in the recent joint statement of the P5 that was published on the 3rd of January. In that statement, the P5 state that they consider the, quote, avoidance of war between nuclear weapon states and the reduction of strategic risks as our foremost responsibilities. This kind of statement can only come about if you've been able to think about what your own responsibilities are first, and then had the opportunity to discuss them with the other parties in the process who've also had the same opportunity. And that's where the framework and the dialogue-based model that we've created can come in. So with that, I'll pass back to Alice. Thanks very much. I look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you very much, Seb, and for both of you for keeping to rough time, and especially you, Seb, for bringing in Nina's work in such a good way there. And with that, I will pass over to Professor Nina Tannenwald to offer some comments and some questions for Seb and Nick and the rest of the team to be thinking about. So over to you, Nina.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I thank the organizers for inviting me to participate. I have written on the topic of responsibility and nuclear weapons myself. So as Seb mentioned, focusing on how we might develop a regime of nuclear restraint and responsibility. So this is a topic that I'm quite interested in and think is very important, and I'm very sympathetic to this project. So I'll begin with some comments on the value of the project, and then pose a few questions to encourage the authors to push their thinking a little farther and also to sharpen some of the points. So why is focusing on responsibilities important? And here I want to tell you a little story about my time in the State Department. So in 2012, 2013, I worked in the Non-Proliferation Bureau of the State Department. And this was at the time when the humanitarian campaign was first getting going. And I had a colleague there who was quite hawkish and was very bent out of shape over the humanitarian campaign. And he said to me one time, who are they to delegitimize our nuclear weapons? And this just captured for me the problem. Basically, he was saying, these are our weapons, and we have a right to do whatever we want with them. That way of thinking is simply not viable in this contemporary nuclear era. And so this got me thinking about the issue of responsibilities and who are stakeholders in the global nuclear order. And it's not just the countries that possess nuclear weapons, it's everybody. So what this Nuclear Responsibilities Project is doing is building from that starting point. They are drawing on the fields of conflict resolution, political psychology, and communication theory, and taking academic ideas about empathy and trust building and translating them into an operationalizable program for getting actors to think about nuclear weapons in terms of what their responsibilities are, rather than rights, as Professor Wheeler said. And this is an incredibly useful framework, and it's really important. That is, that this is a major effort to shift the discourse, right? To shift the way that states talk about nuclear weapons and how they think about what their policies should be. So a key contribution here is to move away from claims about identity toward focusing on behavior. And anybody who has children will understand this. That is, when your kid does something bad, you don't say, "You're a bad child." You say, "That behavior was bad." And this is what they are doing at the level of states. That is, trying to move the discourse away from saying, "You're a responsible state, you're an irresponsible state," to "These policies are responsible or irresponsible. And let's collectively think about what policies would be responsible." The toolkit is really interesting and very useful and very detailed. And I encourage people to take a look at it. It draws, the kind of framework draws from ideas about common and differentiated responsibilities from climate change, for example. The notion of responsibility comes very generally from R2P, from responsibilities to protect. I think these are really useful moves. And the toolkit itself focuses on a very detailed set of practical steps to operationalize this in a particular policy body. So by first asking, well, how do we think of our own responsibilities in terms of nuclear weapons? How do we think the other guy should think about their responsibilities, and so forth? And so at first you do it for yourself, and then you engage in dialogue with other parties. So I think it's a very, very serious, very thoughtful effort to think about how you actually shift discourse in a major policy area. Okay, now some comments and questions. So the first, my first set of questions has to do with the relationship between responsibility and accountability. And my question here is, where is the line between blame and accountability? So the project is very interested in moving away from the blame game, right? Where parties blame each other for problems. But it's not clear about accountability. And it seems to me that it would be useful to have a finer grained approach here to responsibility. That is, the issue of responsibility will differ depending on what issue you're talking about. So the question of who is most responsible for undermining the NPT, I think this project is right on in that. That is, debates about who's most responsible for undermining the NPT are unproductive. But what about the question of who's responsible for the consequences of nuclear use? And that's a really important accountability issue. We want the nuclear weapon states to be accountable for the consequences of their strategic policy. So those are two different issue areas where I think responsibility works differently. And I don't see much discussion in the project of accountability per se, and where that differs from blame, how that differs from blame. A second question related to this: how does responsibility work where the institutional structure of accountability in the NPT is asymmetrical? So here I'm putting my realist hat on a little bit here. Currently, one of the big asymmetries of the NPT is that the Security Council plays a role in enforcing the non-proliferation pillar, but not the disarmament pillar. That is, the oversight and monitoring mechanisms of the NPT regime are much stronger for the non-proliferation pillar, but they don't really exist for the disarmament pillar, right? This is one of the eternal complaints of the non-nuclear states, right? So these are unevenly institutionalized, and the monitoring system for disarmament is not built in the way it is for non-proliferation. So how does responsibility work in that asymmetrical institutional structure? It's not quite a level playing field. And I think the project in the toolkit doesn't make much acknowledgement of the fact that the playing field may not be level, right? It's like this Habermasian ideal, discursive environment. But of course, there are very significant asymmetries in institutional power that provide the context. Okay, so third, then my next set of questions, these are my last set of questions, deal with the connection to policy outcomes. And this is, for the academics in the audience, this is a highly constructivist project. The underlying assumption here is that the underlying distrust is a function of the way we talk, and changing how we talk will fix that. All right, so the realist would probably jump all over that. But I'm quite, as a constructivist myself, I think there's a lot to that, that how we talk about things is really important. And so if there's ever a project that takes this really seriously and thinks systematically about how we do that, this is it. But the project as a whole, in the materials are, I think, a little less clear about how this connects to policy change. And I understand that the authors here don't want to come out with yet another list of what constitutes a responsible actor, because they want that to grow organically from the discussions. But nevertheless, it does mean that it's a little bit unclear whether all this change in discourse is going to lead to actual policy change. And sort of how would you evaluate that? This is a long-term project. Discourse changes, take time, and then how, whether they lead to policy is another step. But it seems to me there's a risk here of entrenching the status quo and just clothing it in new language, unless you have some kind of a ratcheting mechanism like the Paris Agreement has. And this might be a useful device here to think about over time. How do you ratchet up states' conception of their responsibilities and actually get it built into policy so that there's real policy outcomes? I think this is something to think about as the project moves forward. I think they're going to be, my understanding is there are going to be future iterations of the toolkit. And as you think about the project going forward, how might you connect it a little bit more sharply to actual policy outcomes? The toolkit is currently fairly abstract. And so as you move forward and you have some empirical examples, you might want to insert those in so people reading this can get a sense of how it does connect to policy change. So those are some comments. I think I will stop there, and we'll have a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nina. I absolutely loved your parent-child example, and actually that's not something we've heard before in the program, and definitely something I think we can explore further, and especially brings to mind, actually that complex relationship between this idea of responsible identity and status and actual behaviours. So yeah, thank you so much for your comments and 3 wonderful questions. I'm going to go, I see John's got a hand up. I'm going to go back to Seb and Nick first and see if they want to respond to one or all of those questions just briefly or touch on them. And then I'll come to you, John, first, and invite anybody else if they've got any other questions or short comments that they'd like to add. So I don't know between you whether Seb or Nick, you'd like to come back to any of those. I can repeat them as well if you need. No? Fab. Seb, if you want to go first.
Thanks, Alice. I'm happy to come in on this first question of blame versus accountability, and also perhaps a little bit on the last question as well. I think it's a really fair point, and I think there's a spectrum at work here between sort of blame and accountability. I mean, when I use the word accountability, I tend to think about it in a slightly less sort of charged way. I suppose it's about deciding who had responsibility to do something and that perhaps they haven't done, and bringing that back to them. Whereas blame comes with a bit more kind of emotional energy, I suppose. And of course, it's incredibly important to hold people accountable. In a sense, I think that's one of the underlying purposes behind the whole project, is actually to have had a conversation about responsibility, so that later down the line you can say, well, this is one of the things you said you feel you have a responsibility in relation to. This is the distance between the ideal and reality. And there are, I agree, some things that you can only hold the nuclear weapon states to account on. For example, your example of the nuclear weapons testing, for example. And blame, the kind of the more emotionally charged kind of blame, I think, can be a very useful tool in the toolkit of people working in policy as well. And the whole TPNW campaign was based on blame, and that has had some positives and that has had some negatives. I think it managed to bring an awful lot to the attention of the global community. So I don't think it's an either or a black or white kind of issue. The nuclear responsibilities approach was also, I think we had to see it as a product of its time. So it came out of this kind of 2016, 2017 moment where relations between both the nuclear weapon states with each other, but also the nuclear weapon states and the non-nuclear weapon states, was very fraught. If you sat in meetings with representatives from governments across those divides, it was very, very difficult to have a conversation that was really meaningful, because it was incredibly charged. And so I think the problem is when accountability kind of slides into a chronic culture, where you can't actually talk to each other, even at a normative level, you're struggling to talk to each other, to say what you're kind of aiming for, and dialogue has broken down that far. So I think what we're doing here is we're trying to create a space to shift out of that chronic breakdown of dialogue into something that is useful. Now, actually, I think between the nuclear armed and non-nuclear armed states recently, that's got better. And I think that's probably a function of the TPNW coming into force and all that sort of thing. Things have obviously got a lot worse between the nuclear armed states in that same time period. And that's, I think, where we're particularly interested at focusing our efforts now, is to create a space for them to talk to each other about their responsibilities, particularly in relation to one another, with input, important input from the non-nuclear weapon states as well. So as I say, by sort of generating that dialogue on responsibility, I think what I hope is that will actually increase accountability between the various actors who are talking to each other, as well as sort of putting that on the public record where appropriate. In terms of your last question about how this work connects to policy change, it's also important, and I think this is a question I think it's harder for the programme to answer in some ways, because we put a lot of faith in the dialogue, in the process. It's a very process-led project, and the outcomes of such a process are often emergent and unpredictable, but it builds on the experience of a lot of other people who have worked in sort of dialogue processes over a long period of time, who say this is nevertheless useful, even if you didn't know what you were hoping to achieve when you started. I think your point that Nina, the underlying assumption is that distrust is a function of the way we talk, and changing how we talk can fix that. I think that's partly true. I would also say there are kind of reality constraints to all of that, as Jutta Wells would say. There are structural reasons why we might also not get on. So there may be limits to what we can do in terms of changing the way we talk. But, maybe going back to your metaphor of how we talk to children, we know if we talk to children in certain ways, we get better outcomes than if we just shout at them. So I think I take a kind of quite intuitive human approach to all of this in this project. And just based on my own experience as a human, how we talk to one another makes a very big difference to how we get on. And so if we can change that level, even if we have fundamental disagreements about certain structural issues, one would hope that would help then enable us to make progress on those issues. I won't take up any more time, so I'll hand over back to Alice.
Thank you, Seb. And yes, wonderful attempt at answering questions 1 and 3. Well done. Nick, I don't suppose you'll be able to chime in on question number 2, or potentially you have comments to offer on 1 and 3 as well, but keep it as brief as possible so that I can also go back to Nina and the floor.
Yeah, I'm wondering, Alice, whether we should just open this up now, because and then I'll try and pick up Nina's second question in responding to other questions. But just to say, Nina, I thought that was a super set of responses and really captured the heart of what we're trying to do, but also, you know, asked some really probing questions. But I'll try and come back to the asymmetries point as we go along. But I think it'd be really good to hear from the floor. Perfect.
Yes. Well, we've got John with his hand up at the moment, so I'll go to John first and encourage anybody else whilst John's speaking to either raise a hand or put something in the chat. And Nina, if you'd like at some point to come back in on anything that Seb has said, then you are also more than welcome. John.
Thank you, Alison. I hope you can hear me. I think it's absolutely right to have focus on the responsibility for use, as you said, Nina. But I think there's an interim series of responsibilities which are picked up in the paperwork that BASIC's produced, but I think they're today as if not more important, and that is what I would call responsibility for nuclear risk. And it is clearly badly understood risk will lead to use, but you could say to all of the 5 or 9 nuclear armed states that they have an equal responsibility for the implications of nuclear use, but they have very differing responsibilities today and very differing strengths of risk that they bring to the pot. So I think if you focus in some way on the responsibility to reduce nuclear risk, you begin to have leverage on each of the nuclear armed states in a way that differs between them. So so clearly, if you are being DPRK and launching hypersonic missiles and doing tests and all of the things that you've done in the last 5 or 6 years, you're in a different risk profile from, I would suggest, the United Kingdom. And each of the other countries has a different risk. So I wanted to know what your view was, and that of Sebastian and Nicholas, on this concept of risk responsibility, as well as the ultimate responsibility, which is about use. And it draws back in a way to the comment that Seb was making, I think, which is about the positions that each of the states are in now. And I think, therefore, there's value to be had in that. So I leave that as a question. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Are there any other questions at the moment from the floor? I do have one pre-prepared myself that goes to all 3 of you. And it's something that I keep coming back and forth in my PhD is the relationship between responsibilities and norms. And I wondered whether Nina in particular, or perhaps all 3 of you, might like to offer some comments on what you think the relationship between responsibilities and norms are. But we've got a raised hand from Megan. Please, the floor is yours.
Hi everyone, yeah, I'm Megan Deave at the University of Stirling. I guess I'm really interested in this. I love this idea of discourse changing something, and I think there's real merit in it. At the moment I'm doing quite a lot of research on UK nuclear policy, so you'll forgive me if my question's quite oriented in that direction. But I'm just wondering what all of the speakers, what your input is in terms of the shift that the UK has sort of ceased using this framing of a responsible nuclear power, a responsible nuclear weapon state over, well, most tellingly over the last year. Now, the constructivist in me says that this is a shift, it's discursive shift, it's deliberate. The secret realist in me says it's because of the integrated review and they're really embarrassed by it. So I just wondered what the speakers thought. And I know obviously the UK, the government, the FCDO has had input on the project as well. So I just wondered if you had any insights that you could share. Thanks.
That's a great question. Thank you very much. I think we'll perhaps on to pass back to Seb, Nick and Nina as well to perhaps comment on Megan's question and John's. You can ignore mine because I'd much rather you get to speak to both of those. And perhaps Nick as well, you can touch on Nina's second question if you have time to. So perhaps I'll come to Nick, you first, and then Nina, it would be lovely to have your opinion on these questions as well. John's was around this responsibility to reduce nuclear risk, and Megan's obviously on the UK dropping the language of responsible nuclear weapon state. So Nick.
Thanks, Alice. Great set of questions here. I mean, starting with John, and this question of the relationship between risk and use in terms of responsibilities. I mean, I think what I want to say there is that we need to be careful resisting this move where I think you could get quickly into saying that these behaviors are responsible and these are irresponsible, because that's, I think, what we're trying to avoid. So, for example, with the DPRK and the idea that I think what you were suggesting was that they're posing greater risks of nuclear conflict than others. Don't we have to get into a dialogue with DPRK and try and find out how it is that they understand their responsibilities and what are they doing? And I think if they're making claims that they're behaving in a responsible way, but others believe that's irresponsible, then that's the place to have that discussion. Then is a dialogue over those claims. And I take Nina's point that, you know, maybe that does seem too much like a Habermasian, you know, communicative community and ignoring material asymmetries and so on. But I think what we're trying to do on the program is open up the possibility for looking at what it is that's leading people to conceive of their behavior in that way. And I guess what I'd want to say is that, you know, I'd like to talk, you know, about what is it that leads the DPRK to be doing those things. Now, it may be that in the end, we come to the view that, you know, that there's a consensus in the international community that kind of behavior, you know, is not acceptable, and we can come back to the Security Council and so on. But I want to be cautious about imposing from the outside some idea that some people are creating more risks than others. I think we need to have a conversation about that and with the people themselves. And that comes back, I think, to the point that Seb was making, and which I would sort of pick up Nina's second point about the asymmetries. I mean, I think that is a really good point about the Security Council. But I was thinking, you know, when you were talking about Article 24, you know, Article 24 of the Charter imposes on all members of the Council, but especially the P5, a responsibility for upholding international peace and security. The question is, if the P5 can develop a dialogue that takes them towards the idea that, you know, to pick up your idea, Nina, from your article in 2020, you know, that responsible deterrence involves a commitment to disarmament. If the P5 can come to that shared understanding and that shared consensus, then they could use the Security Council in a really important way to take that forward. I mean, one of, you know, Putin has been proposing for a while the idea that there should be a summit, you know, at P5 level of leaders. You know, they've had some leader level meetings in the Security Council in relation to nuclear weapons over the years. And so there is that kind of idea that the P5 could come together and start to use the Security Council in a way that would be more than just the enforcement idea. So I think, you know, the general point about asymmetries is well taken. But I guess that's where, you know, the realist and the constructivist are kind of, you know, you get that tension that, you know, I think a lot of us are, you know, been working with. Yeah, okay, I'll leave it there and pass on to Seb, who perhaps, Seb, you want to pick up the point about the responsible nuclear weapon state with the UK and the role that we've played in helping change that discursive position.
Do you want me to come in, Alice? Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay.
We'll go to Nina, and then we've got two more hands.
Lovely. So I think it's a really good point to pick up on, Megan. I mean, one of the things we really kind of took aim at early in the process was when, well, at least considered early in the process, is what do we think about this language of responsible nuclear weapon state? Is this useful or not? And our conclusion to that was no, we don't support that language within the program, precisely for that reason, that it's about identity and not behavior. And experience very clearly showed very quickly that if you start talking about that, you get uproar from the backbenchers, as it were, of the international community, saying there is no such thing. We don't accept this idea. And so if your purpose is to generate a dialogue between, say, nuclear and non-nuclear armed states, that's not a good way to start. So so focusing on the behavior was a useful thing, and we have gently pushed back on that language wherever possible. I think we can claim some credit. I don't know if it's all the credit, but some credit for the change in language on the UK government side, because it is something that we talked to them about for a couple of years, and in the end, it was actually at an event that we did online back in November 2020 that Sarah Price, the head of CPAC, announced that they would be dropping that language for the first time. So I as I say, I tend to think that's a sort of a positive thing, to that shift from identity to behaviour. What we need now is for all the other nuclear armed states to do the same. And at the moment, I think all of them, including Israel, if you ask them general questions about whether they are a responsible nuclear power in some sense, will say yes in the affirmative. I think we're only at the start of that journey if we want to see that sort of broader rhetorical shift. But our aim within the programme is to start having those sorts of conversations with others in the hope of kind of trying to shift this. I think what you have to make sure you do is that you don't lose something by doing that as well, because in some ways there is quite an important normative marker, a big flag placed down in the ground in front of you saying, I am responsible, which makes you vulnerable, because people can then say, okay, why? And I think what you have to make sure is that by saying, well, you shouldn't really be putting that flag there, you don't then actually make it easier for people not to be held to account, is the accountability point again. Back to you, Alice.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Seb. Nina, I'll open the floor to you if you've got any comments at the moment, but if not, I can go straight to John and Paul.
Yeah, I'll respond very briefly. So on John's comment about risk, absolutely, I think we should be focusing on nuclear risks, not the consequences of use. And here, I'll just say, I think that the nuclear armed states aren't put in the position often enough where they have to talk about the risks of their policies. They get up at NPT conferences and talk about what they're doing for security and safety and how their nuclear weapons are important for deterrence and so on. But they rarely have to give a talk about what are the actual risks of the policies they've adopted. And this seems to me would be a discussion that would be a very useful, fits very usefully into the framework of responsibilities, is that you have these kinds of policies. What do you see as the risks of your policies? And because they never have to articulate that. It's all about how great nuclear weapons are. And so that's, I think the nuclear responsibilities framework creates an opening to ask them to have a bit more of that discussion. Alice, your question about responsibilities and norms. So I think that's really important. And actually, I think listening to the discussion here, I might disagree a little bit with some of the trend of the discussion. I guess if we think about, norms are standards of behavior, and if we're going to ask states to think about their responsibilities, at some point it seems to me that we want them to develop some norms of responsibility, right? And I get it that I think one of the thrusts of the project is we don't want to cram these ideas down people's throats, right? We want actors to collectively arrive at a sense of what their responsibilities are. That's the strength of the dialogue. But it seems to me at some point you have to get to some list of norms, right? That you have to turn responsibilities into norms, else you have no standards at all. And we're in this sort of standardless world. And that doesn't seem to me the outcome you really want here, although it sometimes sounds like the implication of what you're saying. And but right, responsibilities eventually need to be become some kind of norms, right? Responsibility itself needs to be a norm, and then it needs to have some norms about what counts as an unacceptably risky behavior. Are battlefield nuclear weapons risky? Is launch on warning too risky? I mean, there are actual policies that we can evaluate. So that's it seems to be some of a tension here a useful tension in the discussion. I'll stop there.
That's brilliant, Nina. Thank you very much for touching on my question. I do think it's a really interesting one. And I definitely think both Seb and Nick would have some comments on this and like to take that conversation forward. But I will first go back to John and then to Paul before turning back to either Seb or Nick. So we've only got 7 minutes left. So if you can all keep it as brief as possible. John.
Yeah, don't want to be seen to be flogging a dead horse, but I think you're absolutely right to concentrate on whether such a thing as a responsible nuclear weapon state exists or not, but that's existential, and so they've changed the language. But what really matters is what countries physically do and what capabilities they physically have, and Nina has alluded to that just now. So I absolutely disagree, Nick, I'm afraid, with this concept that you can't have relativity, which is how I understood your response. You can't have someone that is more or less acting more or less responsibly. That does exist in the real world, and it must be taken into account. So if you were to buy a new nuclear cruise missile, you're acting more irresponsibly than a country that does not do that. If you do a test with an unratified CTBT, you're obviously acting more irresponsibly with a country that does not. So I think there has to be a league table. Whether the top of the league is called responsible or not is a moot point. But any of this to actually make a difference, any of this must bear more hard and more longer on countries that have more risk and less responsibility in their approach, whether they're called responsible or not. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Paul.
Apologies for being trapped in another Zoom, and I want to refer to something I've already sent round to colleagues in BASIC, which is this is a year which may be the year of the second Russo-Ukrainian war, which has already got a nuclear overlay. I've bringing up this interesting statements by Dmitry Suslov about Russia's absolute need to increase the nuclear threat to America, because that's the only way that America and NATO will take due attention to Russia's legitimate needs. Now, that's kind of interesting, that enhanced nuclear signaling in this crisis we probably haven't heard the end of. So to talk about responsibility it would be a fascinating seminar, but this isn't a seminar. I imagine you won't want a degeneration into name calling, but I can see it working out that way if Russia, it won't be forgotten that Russia is adopting a deliberate strategy of nuclear anxiety building, which raises the question, is that responsible? Can we talk about this stuff without pointing to the way that key nuclear players are adopting behaviors which call into question responsibility? And of course, the Russian response is obvious. You're the irresponsible ones in NATO, threatening a nuclear state with unbearable outcomes in your relentless expansionism. So I think that's quite a likely dispute. In fact, I'd love to start it rolling myself. But is that what you want, or how do you head it off? How do you deal with it if it explodes into a deliberately emotionally filled rant?
Thank you, Paul. I'll pass back to Nick and then to Seb. We've also got a question from Pamela in the chat if you have time and the capacity to touch on that now, but we have only got 3 minutes, so please keep your remarks brief, but cover as much as you possibly can. Nick.
John, I'm not disagreeing with you that we can't have positions as academics and practitioners about the risks that others are running with their behavior. I'm not disagreeing with that at all. But what I'm saying is, in the program, we're trying to avoid arguing that particular people are behaving in a responsible or irresponsible way. I think Nina's point about identities and behaviors is absolutely crucial. What we're interested in exploring then through the dialogue is what behaviors do people consider to be acceptable and unacceptable But I'm not disagreeing that we couldn't, you know, have a seminar about risk registers and have a discussion about that. But in the program, we're trying to use the framework to give people an opportunity to come into a dialogue, to talk about those questions and see what comes out of that. So I think that's a really important point. And I think just to follow up what you were saying, Nina, you know, I think the key thing is we want people to arrive at those shared norms through that process. It's not that we don't want people to come to shared understandings and shared responsibilities. Indeed, the fundamental problem with the responsibilities language is that people have taught the language of shared responsibilities, but when it's actually come to trying to concretize that, they fail to do it. So I think, you know, what we're hoping through this program is that we've got a chance to try to move towards getting those shared responsibilities. But you raise another really important question at the beginning, which is how do you move, even if you could get those shared understandings in a track 1.5 or even a track 2 dialogue, how do you move those into the policy space? And that's why I think what Seb was saying at the beginning about the importance of trying to get this dialogue at the track 1 level is so important. But in terms of the ratcheting up, I mean, I guess, you know, we haven't got time, unfortunately, to go into this, but I guess what we would look towards is something like what was achieved with R2P through the 2005 World Summit Outcome Document and the kind of then the General Assembly and so on. So I think there's a number of mechanisms and processes by which nuclear responsibilities could get much more entrenched. And you could begin to move to what you were saying at the beginning about the Paris Agreement, where you've got, you know, some stronger normative framework there to underpin it. Paul, your question's a really important one. And I guess what I would want to say to that is we need more dialogue with the Russians to try and see if there's any way of coming to, you know, a new understanding about what is responsible behavior in relation to these issues. And obviously, you know, at the moment they're having discussions and it remains to be seen what might come out of that. But your point about, you know, the anxieties and the tensions that it raises, you know, are very well taken. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Seb, you can have 60 seconds for any last remarks, and then I'll wrap up.
I'll be as quick as I can, then. Thanks. I think I just wanted to come in on what Nina and John said, really, which is actually I agree with you, and maybe this shows, you know, some points of disagreement within the program, but I agree that responsibility needs to be a norm, and there needs to be an acceptance of the norm of responsibility per se. And that's where I think statements that says, you know, we take our responsibilities seriously, or these are our foremost responsibilities, are very helpful. And then we need to have that dialogue on what responsible behavior is versus irresponsible behavior. And that's okay, because it's a focus on behavior, not on identity and blame. And ultimately, out of that, we want norms to crystallize. And the important thing there is that those debates are inclusive and they're pluralistic and they're accepting of different points of view. And they're not held by a small number of people who crystallize those norms in their own interest. So I think that is exactly the kind of thing we want. And I just wanted to kind of come in on the ratchet mechanism idea, because I think that kind of relates to this quite nicely. With the idea being that sort of norms hopefully get stronger and stronger over time. We haven't employed this idea directly within the program because we haven't wanted to scare people away, to help. We haven't wanted states to think, well, you're putting us on an escalator that we can't get off. And in some ways, I think it's easier in the climate change regime because we have a positive vision for what a green future will look like. And we have many of the technologies, or at least they seem very easy to invent, or, you know, within the realms of possibility, whether that's renewables or energy storage and so forth. We don't have that same positive vision for a non-nuclear weapons world at the moment. If you ask most people, they don't really know what that looks like. So because of that, I think it's difficult to encourage people onto a ratcheting mechanism because they don't know where it's going to go. And so I think this is, I suppose, a call to arms that I think as a community, we need to invent that vision. We need to describe it and paint that vision very carefully in a way that's positive and not just work on the basis of trying to get rid of something, but actually to replace it, to encourage system change and transition to something better. So I'll stop there. And thank you to everybody for your questions.
Thank you very much, Seb. Yes, we're only 2 minutes late, so I'll just quickly wrap up by saying thank you. to both of our speakers, to Seb and Nick, and especially to Nina for being a brilliant discussant and asking some really thought-provoking questions of us and the programme. And I, of course, should thank the FCDO, the Economic Social Research Council, and the University of Birmingham, who have supported this work for a couple of years now. We obviously couldn't do it without them. And of course, a big thank you to all of you for joining us today. Please do stay in touch with us, whether it's via our social media channels or email us. Please email us, any one of us or all of us, if you're interested in engaging with our work on nuclear responsibilities any further. We do always love to hear from you. So please enjoy the rest of your day, whatever you might be doing. And thank you again.